Greetings, Java students. In part 1, we extended experiment 4, which shoots cannonballs like this, but we added enemy objects that spawn once every 100 time steps. And they spawn off the right-hand side of the screen, and they move slowly to the left. So the next piece is we need to be able to detect, are the cannonballs actually hitting the enemy objects? And if they are, let's have the one destroy the other. Alright. So let's remember how to do collision detection between two circles. This is something we looked at before, but is a little bit mathier, I think, than you're used to. Alright, let's say we have two ball objects that look like this. Remember that this is all on a screen that's a big grid with 0, 0 as the coordinates of the upper left-hand corner. So let's say this ball's center is at x1, y1, and this ball's center is at x2, y2. Here's the idea. We're going to find what's the distance between the center of this ball and the center of that ball. That's the distance of this purple line. And I'm going to see, is that distance bigger than the distance I get when I add together these two radii? Right now in this picture, the purple distance is way bigger than the sum of those two black lines, which means that they're not hitting each other. But I could also draw a version where they are hitting each other, and you'll see what happens. So here is one ball, here's another ball, and they're just barely hitting each other. Let's pretend that those are circles. Here's the purple line distance in between them. But now look what happens. Here's the length of the black radius for one, and here's the length of the radius for the other. If I add together this distance and this distance, you see there's this overlapping section. So the sum of those two distances is just a little bit longer than the distance between the two centers. So when the distance between the centers is bigger than the sum of the radii, they're not hitting each other. And when the distance between the centers is smaller than the sum of the radii, they are hitting each other. So that's the mathematical test we're going to use to see, are the two ball objects hitting each other. Alright, so here I am inside ball. I want to put a method inside the ball object itself. So let's scroll down some amount. And in here I'll create a new method, public boolean isHitting. And it's going to take another ball as an input. So one ball object is going to run this command, and it's going to get another ball object as an input. And it's supposed to see, am I, the ball that's running this, am I hitting this other ball? So let's start by find the distance between the ball's centers. So I know that the distance formula is math.square root of the difference in their x's squared plus the difference in their y's squared. So it's going to be this, where dx is the difference in x coordinate between this ball and the other ball, and dy is the difference in y coordinate between this ball and the other ball. So let's create those. I'll make this float dx. Let's see, so the ball that's running this code, the ball that's running this method, its x coordinate is up here in the field. It's just x. So we've got x. And then the other ball that it's checking against is this ball, the ball that was the input, called other. So I'll say if x minus other.x. So that's telling me the difference between my own x coordinate and the other ball's x coordinate. And the difference in y coordinates is my own y coordinate minus the other ball's y coordinate. So now I've got the difference in our x and y. I'm squaring each one and adding it together, taking the square root, so that's now the distance between the centers. Let's now compare that to the sum of the radii. So I'm saying if distance is, let's see, is hitting, I'm trying to ask, this should return true if they are hitting each other. So let's see, if they are hitting each other, that means that the distance should be smaller than the sum of the radii. So my own radius is my own diameter divided by 2. And the other ball's radius is other.diameter divided by 2. So if that's true, I want to return true because we are hitting each other. Otherwise, I want to return false because we're not. So this isHitting method. Now I can just use it in my other program. So here we are in Castle Defense. Let's create a new method called, let's do it right up here. Let's call it check for collisions. And I'm going to hover over it and say create method, check for collisions. And what I want to do is I want to loop over every single enemy. And then for each one of those, I want to see, is it hitting any particular one of the cannonballs? So let's start by looping over every single enemy. I'll say for int I equals 0, I is less than enemies list dot size, I plus plus. Remember, my enemy is a ball object, so I'll say ball enemy equals enemies list dot get I. So as this loops, I'm getting one enemy out of my list at a time. Now that I've got my enemy, I want another loop. So I'm going to use J as the location for what cannonball object am I looking at. So J starts at 0. J is going to go through the entire cannonball list, which I called cannonball list. So now I've got this loop inside a loop. So what's happening is when I is 0, I'm getting enemy 0. And then I'm going to go through this loop over and over and over again for every single location in the cannonball list. And notice enemy's not changing. Enemy is still what I got out of location 0. So for the 0 location enemy, I'm checking all of the cannonballs. And then once I get down to here, I go back up to the top of this, and now I is equal to 1, and so I get the enemy out of location 1. And then I loop through all of the cannonballs. And then I add 1 to I, and I get the enemy out of location 2, and then for enemy number 2, I loop through all of the cannonballs, and so on. So let's get a cannonball out of the cannonball list. Remember, J is the location of the cannonball list. So far I have an enemy and I have a cannonball. And now I want to know, is the enemy hitting the cannonball? Well, that's what we wrote that method for. So I can say if the enemy dot is hitting, or actually I guess you might like to think about it the other way. It's the same either direction. So if cannonball dot is hitting enemy equals true. And so this asks the cannonball to run the code we just wrote to see whether this cannonball is hitting that enemy. And if the answer is yes, I want to remove both of them from the lists. So I'll say cannonball.remove. Oops, I can't ask the cannonball to remove. I got to ask the list. Cannonball list.remove cannonball. So I'm telling the list to remove the cannonball that I just checked. And the same thing for the enemy list. I'll say enemies list.remove enemy. So now I've removed both the cannonball and the enemy from their lists. If that cannonball isn't hitting that enemy, I don't need to do anything. I'll just go on to the next one. Alright, so now I've got check for collisions. Let's run it and see if it works. Oh, does not work. What happened? Oops, I just forgot a semicolon. Okay. Let's see if it works. There we go. So it looks like I'm definitely able to hit them. Alright, tune in next time for a bunch of nice little extras, like checking to see if the enemies get to the other side of the screen, and for health and life and so on.